So, Andreas Parpas is a prolific author, having published several books, including Alexander the Great, The Dissolution of the Persian Naval Supremacy, The Assyrian Empire in Cyprus, and most recently, the naval economy of Cyprus in terms of the new institutional economics approach. Today, he is here with us to discuss Cyprus during Alexander's campaigns, and it is my pleasure to have Andrea Parpas with us. Again, thank you for accepting my invitation.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here.
So just to begin with, it's something I always do. I almost always start every episode talking about sources. And I think this is a really important conversation to have for this topic concerning the sources in this period. So what are the principal sources that we rely on in reconstructing the past? And were any of these historians present during Alexander's campaigns?
Well, before going through the historians of Alexander, I want to say that there are countless historians who wrote about Alexander. You know, he is such a very complex and controversial personality that made such an impact in world history that drew the attention of many historians. And in actual fact, there is one Alexander for each historian who wrote about his life. And one of the main problems that all these historians are facing is to distinguish between myth and fact, and what is true and what is fiction about Alexander. Now, going about the question about the primary and secondary historians of Alexander, because that's how we look at them. The primary historians are the historians who lived during Alexander's time, and most of them they did participate in the campaign. We do not have the histories of all these historians, only very small fragments. But their histories have been saved and they have been used by the secondary historians who wrote 300, 500 years after the death of Alexander. It is on the histories written by the secondary historians that we rely. Now, if we want to talk about the primary historians, there are the four major ones that I like to talk about. Is the first one is Callisthenes from Olynthos. That this guy he was appointed by Alexander to write the history of the campaign, and he did participate in the campaign. And he has written in a very propagandistic and melodramatic way about Alexander's campaign. The second one is Aristobulus from Cassandria. He was among Alexander's inner circle. He was probably an engineer. The third one, and quite important, is Ptolemaeus Lagos from Eordea. He was a noble person, a childhood friend of Alexander, and a trusted bodyguard, and one of his closest companions. And after Alexander, he became the ruler of Egypt, and he founded the Ptolemean dynasty. His histories are the most reliable ones because not only he had first-hand knowledge of the campaign because he did participate, but he was the one who used and he had access to Alexander's official daily military diary. And the fourth one is Clitarchus from Alexandria. He did not participate in the campaign, but he lived during that time of Alexander, and he's the one that he's quite critical against Alexander, and he looked at his work is more historiographic and novelistic. So these are the four primary ones. The secondary ones that they wrote about Alexander 300, 500 years later, and we have their histories, is Diodorus from Sicily, who wrote Universal or World History. And there are quite a few mentions in his work about Cyprus and Alexander. The second one is Quintus Curtius Rufus. He was a Roman historian, and he wrote the history in Latin in a melodramatic way, and he had in mind the Roman ancient audience. He based his work mostly on Clitarchus, who found his sources from the mercenaries, mostly that they were with the Persian army. The third one is Plutarch, who wrote Alexander's biography. And the fourth one, the most important, is Arrian from Nicodemia. He wrote during the 2nd century AD, and he presented Alexander as a historical figure. He based his work on Ptolemeus and Aristobulus, and he gave a very full and detailed account about the relationship of Alexander and the Cypriots, the siege of Tyre in Afghanistan, and the Battle of the Aegean. So these are the main historians of Alexander, the primary and secondary ones.
And what are some of the problems that historians face when dealing with these types of sources? In particular, I'm thinking more of those secondary sources that you're referring to, because those are the ones that we have the most detail, I believe, and
Yeah.
that can prove to be somewhat challenging for historians.
The main problem is how to distinguish, even from these secondary historians, what is true and what is fiction, and what is a fact and what is myth. Say, for example, reading about Arrian, you see that the history of Arrian is based on facts, and these facts he's drawing from the daily military diary that he had access to. You see, he based his work on Ptolemeus, and Ptolemeus was the one that he had Alexander's body and he buried it in Alexandria. And together with the carriage that carried Alexander's body, there were the military diaries that he had access to. If we look at the work that, say, for example, Quintus Curtius wrote, he based his work on the mercenaries that they were with the Persian army. And you can see quite a lot of conflict in between the various histories. So somebody who is reading the secondary historians now, and he wants to write a history about Alexander, he has to correlate between all these 4 or 5 historians and try and filter out what he believes can be closer to the truth.
Always a historian's challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, to contextualize this episode, obviously, we're talking about Cyprus in Alexander's campaigns. Now, I'd like to just talk about Cyprus first and foremost. Being an island, it's certainly exploited its geostrategic position with regards to seafaring, and which has
Yeah.
been a huge part of Cyprus. I mean, it's an island, of course. Can you speak to some of those institutions? Because I know a lot of your work has focused on that.
Well, Cypriots, they were very skillful and knowledgeable with centuries-old tradition in commercial seafaring, long-distance trade, and warfare. They based their activities on the strategic position of the island and also on the abundant resources on the island, mainly timber for shipbuilding and copper. Cyprus was the undisputed producer par excellence of copper in the ancient times, from the late Bronze Age to even the Roman times. And we can compare Cyprus with its copper long distance trade to Saudi Arabia today, that is comparing copper and oil. We find Cyprus' footprint all over the Mediterranean, even up to Iberia with the trade of copper, in the Aegean with sculptures, up to the Black Sea with the trade of grain, Assyria, Mesopotamia. It was, although being a small island, uh, because of the geostrategic position and the abundant resources they had, and the knowledge and the know-how, they were quite important. The Cypriots, apart from the commercial shipbuilding of merchantmen, they were very skillful in building warships. like Triris, Detriris, Pentiris. And we can say that Cyprus was at that time like a war industry, a naval war industry. And it was not something that it was an ad hoc activity, but it was something quite organized. It was a successful, long standing, continuous institution that required continuous, reliable raw material supply, distribution, planning, management, funding, know how, technical skills, and training, retention of battle ready crews. So we can safely claim that Cyprus, apart from its commercial seafaring activity, had a substantial and profitable naval warfare industry.
Now, during this time, Cyprus has been, I mean, under Persian suzerainty for around 200 years or so. And you actually note that, and I quote, Persians were primarily interested in stable bilateral relations, end
Hmm.
quote. So, why so? I mean, how would you describe Cyprus's relationship with their suzerains, politically or otherwise?
Well, first of all, we have to define Cyprus' political system at that time. Cyprus was ruled by individual institutional monarchies, the Cyprus kingdoms, each one of them with its own independent king and territory. This was a political system that the Persians did not bother to change, and as long as it worked for them, they had no intention of changing it. Most of these kingdoms, like Salamis, Kition, Amathus, Paphos, Soli, they were commercial and war ports that the Persians used. Of course, they were the other ones, that the inland ones, that is Tamasos and Idalion, who had access to the copper mines. Well, although Cyprus was under the Persians and it belonged to the fifth satrapy, we have no evidence of any resident satrap on the island, nor of any substantial military presence apart from military operations after the unsuccessful uprising in the Ionian affair, the Ionian revolt. The Cypriot kings, although of vassal status, they were left alone by the Persians to manage their own internal affairs as long as they accepted Persian political, fiscal, and military control. And this, the Cypriots did it magnificently. This way, their political obedience provided them with a semi autonomous status and a stable bilateral relation between them and their masters. The only time we have upsetting this relationship is when the Athenians tried to put some Cyprus under their control and they failed. And after the peace of Andalkidas, the king's peace, Cyprus was conceded to the Persians. And according to the Odoros, it went through a very long period of prosperity and stability, which is evident from the archaeological finds.
And so they also enjoyed other special privileges. I recall you writing they had reduced tribute, the rights to administer their own internal affairs, and they also had, and correct me if I'm mistaken, immunity from military conscription.
Yeah, well, apart from the political, fiscal, and military obedience that was not negotiable, first and most, the Persians, first and foremost, they had a demand by the Cypriots to pay the tribute assigned to them, either in gold or commodity products like timber, grain, and copper. We have to bear in mind that the island's resources were considered as property of the Persian king. And secondly, but most importantly, they were obliged to put their naval and maritime infrastructure and ports to the service of the Persians and participate with their navies in the Persian navy in the Mediterranean. The Cypriots, together with the Phoenicians, being under Persian control, were under the obligation to build warships for the Persian navy that were paid by the Persian king, and thus they were the property of the king. They were obliged to provide trained sailors and crews, and that might exempt them from regular military conscription. The food provisions and salaries of all these crews, they were paid by the Persian funds. So these squadrons of mainly trirees, the main battle of warships, but also the trirees and petrirees, were under Persian naval control, and the soldiers and the marines were provided by the Persians. So, in a nutshell, Cyprus was not only important for its geostrategic position, but together with Phoenicia, had a very important naval war industry that could provide state of the art warships, trained crews and sailors, and that was essential for the Persian domination of the Mediterranean.
Yeah, and perhaps best illustrated in the Battle of the Aegean, where Cyprus had supported the Persian naval forces.
Yeah.
So, can you describe some of those events, because this is really important to this period and better understanding Cyprus's role in these centuries?
It's important to understand the whole situation. Alexander landed in Asia Minor, and in a very short period, he defeated the Persians at Granikos. He took almost the entire coast and Aligarnassos, and then he defeated the Persians at Issos. Now, this was the battle on land. At the same time, and this is the battle that was this is the part of Alexander's history that has been described quite well by the secondary historians. Why? Because most of them they were interested in that part of the campaign that Alexander himself was involved. At the same time, Alexander had made these major advances in Asia Minor. There was a very important battle going on at the Aegean. In this battle, Alexander was losing. We must understand that the Persians in the Aegean, with the help of the Cypriots and the Phoenicians, had managed to control most of the Aegean. So, whatever victories Alexander had on land, they were more or less cancelled by the fact that the Persians they had control of the Aegean, and by controlling the Aegean, they had control of the flow of grain from the Black Sea to Greece. They had control of the flow of foodstuff from Greece to Alexander on land, and they were obstructing him of getting mercenaries and fresh soldiers. So it was quite an important battle that was going on in the Aegean when Alexander was winning on land. In the Battle of the Aegean, the ships used by the Cypriots, the type of ships, they were superior to the type of ships used by the Greeks. That is, the Cypriots and the Phoenicians, they used state-of-the-art trirees, tetrirees, and pentirees. Instead, the Greeks, they had the older type, the triacontor and the pentacontor.
It's Alexander's victory at Isis that sent shockwaves across all the ancient world. Why is that such a significant and pivotal event, in particular when we think about what's to come with Cypriot allegiances?
Well, the victory of Alexander at Issos was a complete game changer because it opened the way to the remaining lands of the Persian Empire. After, after Alexander's victory at Issos, it was clear that Alexander could not be satisfied with the conquest of Asia Minor, but he was putting a very credible claim to the entire Persian Empire. That's why it was like an earthquake. You see, apart from the Macedonians, very few people could imagine that Alexander would have the success and the early and quick success that he had. Because to start with, they were comparing him with previous campaigns of Greeks into Asia Minor, like Agesilaus from Sparta, and Parmenion, that is the general of Alexander's father, Philippus. More or less, both of them, they had to withdraw. It was not a success. But Alexander proved to be of a superior pedigree. He proved from Granicos to Issos that he was a brilliant strategist and tactician, a ruthless military campaigner, and he was leading a well-trained, better equipped, and quite motivated army of 30,000 Macedonians that they were fiercely loyal to him. That was quite important.
In 332 BCE, Cypriots, they basically abandoned Persian bases and they joined with Alexander. Or what would you attribute these shifting alliances to? And as far as I understand, Alexander welcomed these Cypriot kings. So why didn't he punish them? What could explain that?
As we said before, Cyprus had a prolific naval war industry. And if we look at Ukraine today, the main benefactors of the disastrous war that is going on in Ukraine are war industries. Same in ancient times. When there was a war and Cypriots were required to provide their naval expertise, they were benefiting big. They were like mercenaries, the Cypriots at that time, with their ships and their know-how. Something like the Blackwater Group in Iraq, even the Wagner Group today in Ukraine. And in order to have such a ready standby naval capability, you need money. And that money, it was provided by their Persian master. Say, for example, the cost of maintaining for 1 year the 150 warships that Cyprus built and provided to the Persian Navy was of the order of 2,000 Attic silver talents. That was a hell of a lot of money. On top of that, we have to add the 300 Attic talents that were needed to build them. So, after Persians losing at Issos, it was evident the Persians could not support financially the naval warfare capability that the Cypriots provided them. Who could do that? Alexander. He was the one who was victorious. After Issos, he took the Persian treasury in Damascus, and he was swimming in money. So one of the basic reasons that they switched over is because the victors, the Macedonians, were now able to replace the Persians in funding their navy. And, well, presumably, they left the Persians to join Alexander, not a decision of the moment, but there were some serious negotiations between Alexander's emissaries and the Cypriots and the Phoenicians. They presumably obtained guarantees that they would be indemnified, that it's recognized that they have joined the Persians not because they wanted to, but because they were forced to. And in this way, they were able to negotiate to continue to rule on their own their semi-autonomous kingdoms. And they had, of course, conceded full political, fiscal, and military control to the Macedonians. In a nutshell, they joined the victors and they changed from one master, the Persians, to another, the Macedonians, with more or less the same terms.
Right. And, I found it really interesting to read that King Panaitagoras of Salamis, he supposedly even had a special relationship with Alexander. And you write a fact that marked their behavior towards each other. What was that special relationship that may have been exploited?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that Alexander had a very special relationship with legends and foundations myth. And he had a very close relation with mythology and symbolisms. This was shown when he had freed Troy, when he landed into Asia Minor. So Panagoras and Alexander, they had a very close um, uh, contact relation because Panagoras considered himself a descendant of the founder of Salamis, Tefkros, who was the son of Telamonas from the Aeacid dynasty, while Alexander traced his origin to the same dynasty, since his mother belonged to the house of the Molossians, which was part of the Aeacid dynasty. So we can presume that Alexander looked at Panagoras quite favorably because of that, and of course, because he was the king of the strongest Cypriot kingdom with the major naval contribution in his navy, and of course, Panagoras' bravery at the siege of Tyros.
And this is something that King Panaitagoras played to his advantage. I mean,
Yeah, well, sure, Panagoras played the relationship with Alexander through the Aeacid dynasty quite well to have favor from Alexander. But Alexander was a pragmatist, of course, and he had rewarded Panagoras because he did contribute immensely to the conquest of Tyros.
can you tell us what happened during the Siege of Tyre? Because this was a really significant event, not just in terms of what it accomplished, but the engineering that was needed in order to take the city, which Cypriots were very much a part of.
Tyros, together with Sidon, they were the two major ports in Phoenicia, always in um, antagonism with each other. And during this particular period, Tyros is very good terms with the Persians. And as we have said before, the war in the naval war in the Aegean was still going on, and to many, including the Tyrians, it was not a game over, including the Kytians. Pumiathon, as I hope we can talk about it later. The battle in the Aegean was still raging and it was still going on. Cappadocia in Asia Minor was not suppressed by Alexander, neither Egypt nor Gaza. So they thought, the Tyrians, that by resisting and in this way they were doing a favor to the Persians, they would be rewarded. So it is in this context that Alexander started the siege. We must understand that Alexander started the siege of Tyros without the Cypriot and the Phoenician navies. They joined him a couple of months later. When he realized that he couldn't take Tyros without naval blockade, this is when he had sent his emissaries and he negotiated with in my opinion, it transpires from what happened, negotiated with the Cypriots and the Phoenicians to join him. And the navies of the Cypriots and the Phoenicians joined Alexander at Tyros. He split the navy in two. He took the Phoenician navy with him, Alexander, and he blockaded Tyros from the port that was looking towards Egypt. And the Cypriot navy, headed by Panagoras and with Crateros as the general, they had taken up the siege of the city at the port looking towards Sidon. The Tyrians, they had their own navy as well, and it was a very fierce battle. And during this battle, we know that they had destroyed the ships of Pentagoras and Androcles of Amathus and Basikrates of Curion. And it was only after the intervention of Alexander that these kings, they were saved. Now, going back to the Cypriot contribution, they were instrumental in invading Tyros at the final stages from the port looking towards Sidon. And this is perhaps where Pentagoras might have been fatally wounded, or possibly he was wounded when the Tyrians attacked his ship. Alexander dismissed Pentagoras after conquering Tyros. He sent him back to Cyprus. He gave him a lot of presents, and at his request, he gave back to him the city of Damascus. He took it away from Kition. And this was a big reward for the Salaminians. But of course, he did reward the other Cypriot kingdoms as well. I would imagine perhaps one of the agreements that they had is that should they be successful in taking up, in conquering Tyros, the Cypriots will participate in looting, because looting a very wealthy city like Tyros must have been a very big affair. And possibly, most probably, they have participated in selling a lot of the prisoners as slaves, because something like 15 to 30,000 people, they were taken prisoners and sold to slavery. I can imagine that Cypriots must have a good and healthy portion on this business. So yes, the Cypriots, they had participated not only with their navies, but they participated with the siege engines and with engineers, and they were successful in breaking down very high and very strong walls of the city at the port looking towards Sidon, where they made their final assault.
You make a point, well, that not all Cypriot kings actually supported Alexander, and the king of Kition, he stayed neutral, I believe. But I mean, why would they have stayed neutral? I mean, what's your interpretation of that?
Well, first of all, we know that they have stayed neutral from the fact that there is no mention of them participating in the siege of Tyros to start with. Why did they stay neutral? I believe for two reasons. They believed, I think Pumiathon believed, together with the Tyrians, that it was not game over, that the Persians still had a fighting chance. So at least they could stay neutral. But have in mind that we have evidence that during the siege of Tyros, Pumiathon had minted a lot of gold coins. He had a big production of gold coins from his city, and one can assume that he did that to fund the Tyrian resistance. Pumiathon must have participated in the Battle of the Aegeans together with the other Cypriots, with the Persians, although again we do not have the evidence. Kition was a very rich Cypriot port, and this is where we have the majority of the Semitic speaking Cypriots residing, that they were originated from Phoenicia. There was a special relation between Kition and Tyros. Certain historians, they even claim that Kition was a colony of Tyros, something that other historians are disputing. This is not something that we can discuss right now. That's a very big question to be settled, but there is no doubt that there was a very special relation between Kition and Tyros, and that is another reason that they have stayed away and they did not participate in in the Siege of Tyre.
Do we know what the consequences were? I mean, for we know that he lost the mines of Tamassos. Why didn't he face more consequences by Alexander? In fact, I believe the king of Kition provided Alexander with a sword, a very famous sword that he used in Gaugamela. Well, why again? Why wasn't he punished more?
We can only presume. Yes, he did try to mend fences with Alexander by giving him this sword. Possibly Alexander was too busy after Tyros to take up Gaza, to conquer Egypt, and prepare for the Battle of Gaugamela. Possibly Kition had understood that it is game over, and they did participate in the naval fleet, that a standing naval fleet that the Cypriots provided to Alexander. Of course, he was restricted to Myathon, like all the Cypriot kings. For the time of Alexander's campaign and during his life, none of the Cypriot kings and kingdoms, including Kition and Pumiathon, were allowed to mint any coins in the name of their city or their kingdom. They were doing that in the name of Alexander. Yeah, we do not have any evidence that Kition was punished any further. Perhaps Alexander didn't have the time for that, and he didn't want to spend
Right,
time for it. Yeah.
right.
He got what he wanted, and he wanted to move on.
Now, this isn't the end of Cyprus's role in Alexander's campaigns. I was very surprised to learn that Cypriots were involved in supporting Alexander's campaigns well into Asia. I mean, as engineers, as oarsmen, as shipbuilders, even as commanders on the Indus River and
Yeah.
in India. What do we know about what other positions they fulfilled, and how important were Cypriots in Alexander's war machine?
Well, to start with, they provided a standing fleet in the Eastern Mediterranean. They joined the Macedonian navy together with the Phoenicians with 100 ships to assist Antipatros, who was fighting Agis III, who was still trying to win Crete and bring the Persians to Peloponnese. So that was one contribution towards Alexander after the successful siege at Tyros. They have contributed to the pacification of the Aegean by joining the Macedonian effort to eliminate piracy. And they provided naval escort for ships that they were going from Greece to Phoenicia and to Egypt and to Asia Minor. They also helped Alexander to build a fleet that he used in Mesopotamia and in his plans to conquer the Arabs. They supplied Alexander with raw material and ship parts that they were transported to Thapsacos on the Euphrates, where they were reassembled, and they have taken them to Babylon. And yes, they did participate in the campaign to India. We have two Cypriot noblemen mentioned in Arrian, that is Niphathon from Salamis and Nicocles from Soli, who served at the Hindus as triarchs in charge of their own triary ships. Triarchy was an Athenian institution where a wealthy citizen will contribute towards the navy of the city by providing one or two triaries according to his wealth, together with the crews and together with all the expenses to maintaining and run it. So these two Cypriots, they have participated as triarchs. That means they were wealthy, of status who provided with their own funds the means for Alexander to have treaties at the Indus River. We also know that Alexander had used the Kerkuros ship for transporting supplies, and the Kerkuros ship, it is a Cypriot invention. So we can presume that at the Indus River, not only he had people like Niphathon and like Nicocles, but he had Cypriot shipwrights who built for them this special type of ships.
Cypriots, I learn, even including Stasanor of Soli and Stasander, they were given administrative positions in Bactria and even satrapies. Do the sources tell us what their contributions were that garnered so much favor with Alexander? Because it seems like that's a pretty significant reward of service for the period.
Yeah, it definitely was very significant. Not only they were given the satrapies of, Stasanor was given the satrapy of Aria and Dragiana. Aria is today's modern city of Herat in Afghanistan. He was also promoted to the elite rank of companions. And we know that he had excellent working relations and even friendly relations with Crateros. Crateros, he was the general who, together with Pnitagoras, was in charge of the Cypriot navy at Tyros. And Crateros was one of the strongest and a very good friend of Alexander. And by Stasanor having such good relations with Crateros, we can assume that he had some very good contacts with Alexander as well. Otherwise, he wouldn't get these two satrapies. We know that at Triparadisos, that is after Alexander's death, when the successors met to split his empire, Antipatros had appointed Stasanor as satrap of Bactria and Sogdiana, while he gave to his compatriot Stasandros the satrapies of Aria and Dragiana. Both of them, they were elevated to the rank of companions. It's not a coincidence that both of them, they were from Soli. We talk a lot about Salamis being the strongest of the Cypriot kingdoms at the time, but Soli, in my opinion, was of equal footing. They had very easy access to timber and copper mines, and the port of Soli had a better access to the Aegean than any other of the Cypriot kingdoms. So it must have been a very, very rich kingdom, and that is also obvious from the way that the successors fought to have Soli's support after Alexander's death.
So, how would you characterize Cyprus under Alexander? If we could sum this up, was this definitively a period of prosperity?
I would say that during Alexander's time, there was a prolonged period of prosperity for Cyprus. Why? For two reasons. First, they were able to supply Alexander with a standing fleet. Together with the Phoenicians, they were the ones that they could support Alexander's navy. Have in mind that Alexander didn't trust the Athenians. So he was not depending too much on the Athenians as far as his naval capabilities were concerned. So Cypriots, being, as we said before, the navies of the sea, the mercenaries of the sea, they provided a standing navy to Alexander, and that was quite a big income for them. And of course, during peacetime, because after Alexander, the Eastern Mediterranean was pacified, well, during peacetime and pacification, then trade and growth is what is the order of the day. And this is what happened with the Cypriots at that time.
Something that's happened after Alexander's death is I noticed a distinct shift in policies.
Yes.
during the war of his successors. When Cyprus changed allegiances and joined Alexander, they kept their city kingdoms, their unique form of rule remain unchanged. But after the war of his successors, the city kingdoms of Cyprus were abolished, and most of the kings were either arrested or executed. I mean,
Yep.
what can account for this sudden change in policy after, if we can assume that what had existed under Alexander was successful? Why now do we have such a violent change?
Well, Alexander definitely was a different person than his successors. During Alexander's time, there was absolutely no claim on anybody else on who was the leader. With Alexander's death, we have the disastrous and merciless wars of the successors. They were really merciless. And Cyprus, because of its geostrategic position, was entangled into this merciless war, and they couldn't control how they would place their allegiances. Some of them supported the Ptolemies, like Salamis, Amathus, and Paphos, and Soli. Others, they supported their opponents, most notably the Antigonids, and these are the kingdoms of Kition, Marion, Kyrenia. There were a lot of conflict of interest, frequent changes of support, and in situations like that, you cannot survive the anger and the way that a stronger army will treat you. The Ptolemies, they wanted to have Cyprus under their control for many reasons. And although they did put the island initially under the control of Salamis, they found out that the other kingdoms, they wouldn't accept that. So there were a lot of infighting in between them, and the Ptolemies, I would presume, they decided they had enough. So Ptolemaeus appointed his brother Menelaus as strategos in Cyprus, and he had eliminated anybody who he thought he was a threat. In any case, their policy was to make Cyprus a province in the Ptolemean kingdom. And in a province in the Ptolemean kingdom, 10 little kinglets didn't have any place. That's why they have eliminated an institution that is the Cypriot kingdoms that lasted for 1,500 years.
What else would forever change in Cyprus?
A lot. You see, with the Ptolemies, we can say that the Hellenization proper of the island started taking place. To start with, the Greek alphabet and the Greek language prevailed over the Cypriot syllabary. That was it was the expressing vehicle of the indigenous languages. It prevailed over the Phoenician alphabet. That was the writing tool of the Semitic-speaking people in Cyprus. That they were quite a lot and very successful merchants. But the most important thing is that Cyprus became of the Ptolemean kingdom as a province. And it remained as a province for 250 years until Cyprus was taken over by the Romans and had entered as a province from the Ptolemeans, as a province now to a much bigger master, the Roman Empire.
And now, Andrea, you've recently published your latest book, Naval Economy of Cyprus, in terms of the new institutional economics approach. Can you tell me briefly what your focus was with your latest publication and what your research has found?
First of all, I looked into my new book, into the Cyprus maritime economy, from the economy point of view, and I split the period in three periods, three economic periods. And I have looked into these economic periods from the point of view of the new institutional economic theory by examining the institutions that prevailed on the island. And I had found out that what made the island successful and what made the island prevail over so many centuries was the fact that it had working and functional institutions that lasted from the late Bronze Age until until the very time that the Ptolemies dismantled the Cyprus kingdoms. The most important of these institutions is the kingship. Other institution was the long distance trade of copper, language, religion, and all these institutions have not changed much over the centuries, and they were functioning, and they gave a working foundation on which the Cyprus economy and societies they were built. And I'm looking at how important institutions are to the success of any economy or society. And in actual fact, the new institutional economics theory says that if you want to look at the success of any society, you have to look at how its institutions are functioning properly. And let's take a very simple example. One important institution that failed Cyprus during our time, and that is the constitution that was given to the Cypriots after we came out of the British Empire. That constitution did not work. It provided with separation between the communities of the island, and it was not able to function properly. That basic institution failed. We have all the failures that followed later. And during the many centuries of ancient Cyprus, from late Bronze Age until the Ptolemies, the institution of kingship was something that it did not move. And it was a properly functioning institution on which the society, economy, and everything else was based.
Andrea, thank you so much for joining the History of Cyprus podcast and sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. This was really an excellent episode.
Well, thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about Alexander, talk about Cyprus in the ancient times, and about my work. Thanks very much. I enjoyed it as well.
You take care. Have a great night.
Bye. Same to you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.